Hey, what's up everyone? Hope you're all having a great day. Today I wanted to talk about learning and improvement, and more specifically the kind of things that can get in the way of that process even when we're trying our best. When it comes to competitive games, trying to improve yourself as a player is a fairly common goal that most people set for themselves. Everyone wants to be better at the game, and regardless of where we are in our journey, we always want to believe that we can push just a bit harder and get to the next level. If we made it to Gold 3, it's natural to want to try a bit harder and get to Gold 2. And if we make it to Gold 2, maybe we can try even harder and get to Gold 1. And for the truly competitive player, no rank is ever truly satisfactory. The challenge is that although the desire to improve is continuous, the actual progress we see in ourselves is often not. Maybe you're the kind of person who gets into a new skill and finds yourself learning things very quickly, but then inevitably gets stuck after a certain point. As the saying goes, practice makes perfect, so when we want to get better at something, naturally we do it a lot, especially if we enjoy the thing that we're doing. But a common problem that we face is that although we want to improve and we genuinely and deliberately practice with intent, we can, for reasons that are not obvious, get stuck. This is somewhat confusing because in order to get to the point we already got to, we just practiced and it worked. So if things start getting more difficult, maybe more practice must be the answer. And inevitably, we try this approach, and over time we might still notice ourselves improving a bit, but even if we do, it's not at the rate that we would like. We might try thinking harder or practicing harder, whatever that means, and yet oftentimes we can still stay stuck at the exact same spot we're already at. This can conflict with what we hear higher level players say. We might be told by those more experienced that in order to get good at the game, you just keep playing the game and eventually it'll happen. Indeed, from the perspective of great players, this might be exactly what they did. At some point they played the game for the first time, and then at another point they played the game for the 10,000th time, and then they got better. Seeing and hearing this can be quite discouraging because we often find ourselves doing something that at least looks very similar, but we wonder why we don't get similar results. These kinds of people are often referred to as gifted or talented, and these words are used to explain why certain people are good at certain things, while simultaneously not really explaining anything at all. A gift, in the more literal sense, is usually an object, or at the very least, a kind of concept. But when we use the word gifted with respect to skills, it's really just a hand-wavy way of saying that it's the thing that makes you good at stuff. So when we say that someone is good because they're gifted, what we're really saying is that they're good because they have the thing that makes them good. Which is not a particularly meaningful statement. If there's something that makes the person good, the obvious question is, what is it? We often use passion or dedication to describe the phenomenon, and while passion and dedication are helpful when it comes to learning, they only describe how someone feels about something rather than how they do it. The question remains, what are passionate and dedicated people doing that gets them results? Another term we might hear is hard work. People who are good at things just work harder. And although that may be true, again, that doesn't really tell us what we want to know. Hard work simply implies a greater exertion of effort, but it doesn't tell us what we really want to know about, which is the link between effort and improvement. Ideally, we would like our ability to learn to be as efficient as possible, regardless of how we might feel about the thing that we're learning. Even if we're lazy and we only want to practice for 30 minutes a day, we want to make the most out of that time. When we want to learn something, there must be some connection between practice and progress. If we stop seeing progress, it must mean that there's something about the way that we practice that might be fundamentally flawed. It might not be some lack of brain power that causes us to be stuck in our progress, but rather an error in our approach. Our brains are wired for learning, and the neurological mechanisms themselves work automatically. Fundamentally, all skills, whether it be mechanical skills, analytical skills, social skills, or emotional skills, all rely on the same mechanism for learning. To put it very simply, to do anything, your brain has to fire certain neurons in some way. Signals need to travel from one part of the brain to another via what are called neural pathways. The more a certain pathway gets used, the more efficiently these signals are able to travel, making certain actions feel more intuitive and automatic over time. If learning for some reason stops, then there must be something getting in the way of that mechanism working properly. Naturally, learning is about acquiring a new skill, or perhaps acquiring a higher level of an already established skill. Intuitively, repetition is the key to learning and building those neural pathways, but a mistake that often we don't realize is that we're not repeating anything new, and so nothing new gets acquired. This problem sounds like something that should be easy to avoid, and it is precisely because of that we can become trapped in a cycle of cognitive bias that we remain unaware of. A cognitive bias is simply an error in logic that leads us to incorrect conclusions, and of course, the biases can work to hinder the process of learning. It's speculated that the tendency to be biased is a remnant of a survival mechanism that would have been helpful in a more primitive lifestyle. If all we're looking for is survival, then most things are already relatively straightforward. Don't poke the bear, don't jump off a cliff, and don't eat smelly food. In those situations, even if our evaluation is not accurate, it's probably better to just leave good enough alone, and certain cognitive biases can stop us from taking unnecessary risks. But this natural instinct can carry over to more complex problems, even when there's no risk of death. And the challenge is that we're often unaware that it's happening, even if we recognize the existence of bias. So when we're trying to learn and improve in complex problems like becoming good at a game, our biases work against us. If we can figuratively immunize ourselves against these biases, we might be able to recognize when they're happening and stop them from hindering our progress. Perhaps the most common cognitive bias is confirmation bias, the tendency to ignore falsifying information that rejects our preconceived beliefs and only accept confirming information that aligns with our beliefs. You've probably encountered this problem in real life with real people. It's an issue that can affect anybody in a variety of situations, not just games. About 9 years ago, a popular science YouTuber by the name of Veritasium made a video demonstrating this phenomenon. He told various people that he was thinking of a rule that governs sequences of numbers, and it was their job to figure out what that rule was. To figure it out, they could ask two kinds of questions, propose an answer, or give their own sequence of numbers that he would then confirm or reject based on his rule. He starts with an example of a sequence, 2, 4, and 8. Rightfully and confidently, the first thing people said was that the rule must be that the sequence of numbers doubles every time. To which he replies that no, that's not the rule. What happens after that point is very interesting. Confused, people start proposing their own sequences of numbers to test their theory, and they propose sequences like 16, 32, 64, 36, 12, 10, 20, 40, 5, 10, 20, 100, 200, 400, 500, 1000, and 2000. They continue to insist that the numbers are doubling and express their disbelief that that's somehow not the rule. The interesting thing is that the first question answered was that multiplying by 2 was already not the answer, but despite that, all the sequences of numbers proposed, although increasingly creative, served only to reconfirm that belief. With a bit of a hint, someone finally said 247, which turned out to also follow the rule, and therefore was actually new and helpful information that falsified the belief that the numbers were doubling. To make it short, eventually someone said 1098, and somewhat hilariously, the rule was simply that the numbers had to be increasing. The insight is that even in such a simple and silly problem, we can already be trapped in a cycle of confirmation bias. When we're new to games, we often don't suffer from this bias as much because there aren't many beliefs to speak of when we're a new player. As we become more experienced, we often develop stronger beliefs and opinions about how the game is quote-unquote supposed to be played. We proceed to ignore information that say we're wrong and only pay attention to the things that say we're right, and we develop an incorrect perspective about the game that leads us to doing the same bad habits over and over again. This results in a kind of feedback loop, where because we only pay attention to confirming evidence, we develop even stronger beliefs about our playstyle, amplifying the effect of confirmation bias even further. We often don't notice that this is happening, and so we end up playing hundreds of games repeating these same mistakes, while wondering why after so much practice we aren't seeing progress. We might try thinking harder, but if what you're thinking about utilizes the same erroneous pattern, then you're just going to end up thinking and practicing how to do things wrong. One major reason this problem is so prevalent is because the evidence we gather, although incomplete, might actually have legitimacy. As we learn the game initially, the playstyle we develop might be good enough to help us climb from, say, bronze to gold, and so we assume that the playstyle is viable to continue climbing from, say, gold to diamond. If you become stuck at gold, you have real evidence that your playstyle isn't good enough anymore, but you do have legitimate prior evidence of the playstyle working from bronze to gold. Confirmation bias can cause you to ignore the new evidence, and so you continue to stay trapped at the same skill level. In order to escape this cycle, you need to start looking at the bigger picture and update your beliefs accordingly. When was the last time you recall updating your beliefs about the game because you found evidence that you were incorrect? If you can't remember, then maybe you're a victim of confirmation bias. If you find yourself very confident about your opinions, that should serve as a warning sign. Even if your opinions are not your own and you learn them from a more experienced player, remember that although what they're saying might be valid, your interpretation of what they say may not be. Regardless of where you get your beliefs from, be careful about attaching yourself too strongly to those beliefs. Admitting you were wrong does feel uncomfortable, but it's an essential step to the learning process that we often forget to look for. Another bias that makes things difficult to learn, especially in games, is outcome bias, the tendency to value decisions by their ultimate outcomes and ignoring the context in which those decisions were made. Suppose you're taking what is supposed to be a difficult math test, but you don't really feel like studying, and so you don't. It turns out that the math test was actually really easy and you get a very high score, and so you conclude that not studying was the right thing to do. Looking at the example from the outside, this is of course bad logic. Even if the outcome was good, that doesn't mean the decision to not study, given the information you had at the time, was a good decision. In games, where the only source of information are the games we play, we can often judge our decisions too heavily based on the end result of the game. If we make certain decisions and we win, we might conclude that they were good decisions, and conversely, if we made certain decisions and we lose, we might conclude that they were bad decisions. But in games where there can be a lot of random variance just due to playing on different maps or with different teammates or with different team compositions, this isn't a very good model for determining which decisions are correct. You might watch some educational content that tells you that a certain decision is a good idea. But then you try it out in game and it doesn't work out. Maybe you die or maybe you lose the game. You might be tempted to conclude that the information you got must have been incorrect, but there's much more holistic ways to diagnose why certain decisions didn't work out the way you expected them to. Perhaps the coach we were watching was trying to generalize and the specific situation we ran into was the exception. Perhaps we didn't execute what we were taught correctly, or perhaps the most simple explanation is that sometimes, even with a good theory, things just don't work out in practice because of a bit of randomness. Suppose you were told that high ground gives you an advantage, but then you try it out in game, and you get dove by a Winston, a Genji, and a Reaper, and then you die. Should we conclude that high ground is a bad idea based on that outcome? In truth, although high ground can be generalized to be advantageous, in that situation maybe the high ground was disadvantageous because it isolated you from your team. Or maybe you simply should have given up the high ground when you noticed they were about to dive you and your team wasn't there to help. It's important not to look at just one input variable and base its validity on the output. In something as complex as a game, there are almost certainly many inputs that work together which lead to the final outcome. On the topic of final outcomes, there's another kind of bias called the recency bias. Sometimes this bias is seen as one half of a larger kind of bias called the primacy and recency bias. It's a fancy way of saying that we are more likely to remember and excessively place emphasis on events that happened first and events that happened last. When it comes to games, I think the recency bias, emphasis on things that happened last, is a common mistake when players reflect on their own games, particularly their losses, but also sometimes their wins. Sometimes when we try to think about why we lost or won a game, we look at the last thing that happened. Maybe we made a big mistake at the end and we say to ourselves that if we hadn't made the mistake, we would have won. Perhaps you mistimed your ultimate at overtime and then you die, and then your enemy team captures the point, and you blame that mistake for being the reason that you lost. And maybe that's true, but it's unlikely that the final mistake was the only mistake that you made the entire game. If you only reflect on the last thing you did, you miss out on a lot of learning opportunities that happened within the entire game. It's not just the last 10 seconds that matter. All 10 minutes are worth considering, and every decision ultimately leads up to the final outcome. Inevitably, the middle parts of a game are always easier to forget, which is why it's important not to just reflect on your performance after a game, but also during a game. Don't just reflect on your decisions when the game is over. You can also think about them while you're making them, or after you make them, in the spawn room when you die, or when you're waiting for the enemy at the choke point, or in between rounds. If you autopilot and wait until the end of the game to think, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're wasting the majority of your learning opportunities. The final type of bias that I'm going to talk about is overconfidence bias, the tendency to subjectively overestimate your expertise in a particular topic, leading to inaccurate conclusions. This issue manifests when we try to analyze our own gameplay. While rewatching or reflecting on our own decisions is not a bad thing, issues arise when we place too much value on our own judgments. We might see ourselves play and theorize about all the ways that we could have played better, assuming that the solution we came to in our head is automatically valid simply because we thought about it. Or conversely, we may theorize about all the ways that we couldn't have played better and assume that nobody could have carried a game simply because we weren't able to. It takes coaches and analysts a ton of experience and experimentation across thousands of games in order to develop a solid theory about how the game works. When we judge our own games, is it more likely that somehow we're geniuses who shortcut the process, or that we are probably a bit too confident for our own good? Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't reconsider our decision making, just that we should treat our reflective process as merely that, an opportunity to reconsider, rather than a way of achieving true understanding through what basically amounts to guesswork. Hypothesizing about how to play better is good, but be careful about how you make conclusions. Although we can't necessarily get rid of our own biases all the time, I think acknowledging them can equip you to recognize them more easily, stop them from halting your progress, and ultimately make your learning experience significantly more enjoyable. Remember that progress is usually not linear, so we shouldn't be disappointed just because we might get stuck at certain points. Where we get stuck is usually a sign that we've reached our current limitations, and it's actually a good thing because it's precisely at this point that real learning can happen and we can find ways to expand our capabilities. And that's all I have to say for now. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.